afternoon, everyone. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. It is a real honor today to have Ms. Ahunwa Ezeakonwa with us to speak about coronavirus in Africa, response and building back stronger. So just really quickly, I'll give an introduction, and then I will turn it over, and we'll have time in about half an hour for Q&A. So, just so you all know who you have the honor to hear from today, Ms. Ahunwa Ezeakonwa officially began her role as UNDP's Assistant Administrator and Regional Director for Africa in August of 2018. In this role, she leads the UNDP's work supporting 46 countries in Africa to achieve Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Prior to taking up this post, Ms. Ezeakonwa was the UN Resident Coordinator and the UNDP Resident Representative and UN Humanitarian Coordinator in Ethiopia, as well as the UN Resident Coordinator and UNDP Resident Representative in Uganda, and before that she held the same position in Lesotho. She has also worked as Chief of the Africa Section for the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, where she managed over 15 country operations in Africa. Before joining the United Nations, Ms. Ezeakonwa held a series of senior positions with civil society organizations in Africa. She holds a master's degree in international affairs with a focus on economic and political development from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and she is personally passionate about broadening the space for engaging youth and women in sustainable development. So we are really quite lucky to hear from her today about the UNDP's response in Africa. With that, I will turn it over just with a quick note that if you have a question to ask at any time, please do put it into the Q&A box. And if you are calling in, you can email Brian at bthang@network2020.org, and he can put that in the queue for you. And he'll also post all those instructions. So, Ahunwa, over to you.
Thank you, Courtney, and thanks a lot for inviting me to this platform. And let me say a big hello to all the network members. It's a pleasure to spend this hour with all of you. I suppose most of you are in New York, so here's also wishing you well as we go through this crisis here. I have been, as you heard from Courtney, most of my work life has been on the continent of Africa, and I am myself an African. Grew up on the continent, went to school there for the most part. And I have to say that I've never actually, it's a continent that's been through a lot. Civil wars, other pandemics such as HIV/AIDS, Ebola, and poverty, and a lot of stress in the last decades. And I would say that actually it was only about a decade and a half ago that the tide started to turn for the continent. We've had these 2 decades of good news stories. And when I took on this position, I took it with very high spirits because I could see that indeed the story was changing on the continent. I think for the first time one felt that we could really talk about a continent of hope, which we could talk about a continent that is where you would have the future of development. We saw several African countries really speeding ahead in terms of their growth, double-digit numbers. We could see while the rest of the world was turning into nationalistic and protectionist tendencies, African countries were renewing Pan-Africanism. It's like, the rebirth of Pan-Africanism, and really linking up with each other. We saw integration of the continent coming through in real terms with the signing of the Africa Free Trade, Continental Free Trade Area, which is bringing all the countries of the continent together for Africa to trade with itself. We also saw several conflicts that had been raging on the continent going down. There was new violence in places like the Sahel and the Lake Chad regions. But for the most part, Africa's big civil wars had ended. And we could see the emergence of a new generation as well. It's a very young continent. In most countries, young people make up 60 to 70% of the population. And from where I sat, I was really infused with the kind of creativity and innovation that was emerging from African youth, both in terms of the tech industry, but also the creative industries. I myself come from Nigeria. We saw the emergence of Nollywood as a serious player, the collaboration with Hollywood as well. So Africa integrated within itself, but also with the world. And at the same time, one felt this sense of a continent that was now serious about taking care of its own development, about taking charge of its own destiny. You saw leaders emerging in Ethiopia, in Botswana, everywhere, where accountable leadership was starting to take center stage, even with all the challenges that still existed. So this is what's at stake, with the arrival of COVID-19, because even for myself leading the Africa Bureau in UNDP, last year we had our regional cluster meeting in Ghana, and the theme that we chose was Africa's Money for African Development, a future beyond aid. So you had countries already thinking of how they were going to wean themselves of sort of the aid culture and really look into the resources that were African and that could transform the continent. So in terms of even the mentorships, they were starting to happen. And then COVID-19 happens, and one wonders where does that take the continent? Does it put a pause on all that optimism? Does it compel leaders to see the urgency of accelerating those development pathways even more? Because the alternative is a world where, pandemics such as coronavirus would not go away, because you would have economies that are just not strong enough and institutions and structures not strong enough to overcome the impact of this. So, we're at a crossroads in the world, but also in Africa. Is this going to lead to a breakthrough in the way we govern economies and states, or is it going to send us to an ICU? So this is, I guess, the dilemma that one is facing right now. In terms of the impact of this on the continent itself, is devastating. I think it is at a level that none of us has ever seen from many dimensions. The first is that this is a continent that had pre-existing conditions. In other words, we still had countries recovering from conflict. We still had huge areas of the continent that were fragile and vulnerable to climate change and other conditions. Cyclone Idai had just hit less than a year ago, or just over a year ago, the southern African countries, and they had not even recovered. We had a locust invasion in the Horn of Africa that was spreading into West Africa, not completely over that. We had an Ebola outbreak in DRC. Some people may not even remember this, had not been declared over yet. So, and of course, Africa still wrestles with lots of pockets of poverty. So all these pre-existing conditions means it's a continent that really can't afford this disease. And not that anyone can, but if it is as tough as it is for advanced countries, imagine what it would look like if 10 million Africans were to contract coronavirus, which is the estimate that WHO is currently giving, should the containment and mitigation efforts not succeed. And so the second part is what really helps to stop this disease on its tracks: social distance. It's exactly what it's difficult to achieve on the continent of Africa from two dimensions. One, it is an anomaly in the African essence, in the sense that life on the continent is based on social connections. It's based on that physical closeness. But at the same time, because of poverty conditions, you have densely populated informal settlements that it's practically impossible to sort of, put people apart and maintain that distance. At the same time, life on the continent in terms of the economy, you have informality, informal economies. You have daily wage people. You have people who basically go out every day and make a living for that day, for themselves and their families. You cannot lock them down easily. Locking them down basically means killing their livelihood. So it's a killer disease. And the way to stop it is equally a killer for the continent in terms of the context of Africa. So what are the options is what many African governments are looking at today. How do we save lives while protecting livelihoods? And it is the biggest question on the table right now for every African leader, whether you are in South Africa, which is the epicenter for the continent with the highest numbers so far registered, or you are in Comoros, which has not registered one case, possibly because of lack of testing. But whether you are, wherever you are on the continent, whatever your numbers, you're wrestling with these questions because African countries know that it's only a matter of time if nothing is done for those numbers to escalate and overwhelm the health systems, which are extremely weak at this point. So the only option is really to stop this thing in its tracks. And the way to stop it means that you have a huge socioeconomic impact because livelihoods will be affected and are already being affected. We're seeing hunger rising. And the impact on Africa is also a result of the fact of the structure of the African economy. It's largely based on import-export dynamics. So Africa imports a lot of what it eats. And this is why we're currently worried about food, because already there was a food crisis in several places. So how will this affect food, the food situation? Oil constitutes up to 40% of exports and the GDP of a lot of countries that have oil. Price has just crashed to negative. So what does this mean for those economies being able to sustain themselves and to use the resources they have to affect change in the situation? So recovery is going to look quite scary on the continent. At the same time, I would say the issues around debt and debt relief are coming up as well, because already there were quite a few countries that were facing debt distress. And now just the contemplation that they may have to take more debt to be able to get out of this crisis is something that people are really looking at as a severe consequence. And so there are calls for debt relief. There are calls for stimulus packages that could be provided to small and medium enterprises on the continent. It is a continent where you have maybe about 80% of women who work in the small and medium enterprises and informal sectors. So if they're hugely affected and they're also the caregivers, what happens? And we look at the impact of this on women. It's serious. Women are the ones who are there for the families. And now you have kids out of school. In East and Southern Africa alone, over 100 million kids have stopped going to school. And it's not going to look like what you and I experience here in New York or other places in the States, where your kids continue learning online, virtually. In most of these places, that's not an option. So we are, as a UN system, starting to look at e-learning as options for the continent, and e-learning strategies are being developed with companies, with private sector companies, IT companies that could support such efforts. So we're looking at a crisis with catastrophic consequences on a people, but also a crisis that reveals where we are failing as leaders, as development actors, shows the cracks in the models that we have been using to address needs in these countries. And one crack is that development models probably, or the way governance, global governance and national governance is approached, has not always put people at the center. So you're looking at an opportunity to create the people economy, to create economies that take into account these informal sectors, that take into account the small, medium enterprises, that take into account the young industrialists, that take into account the women, the small smallholders, farmers, for instance. We haven't paid enough attention to farmers in the past. And yet, these are people who feed the world and who will feed Africa when the crunch comes. So the rural economy becomes a very interesting center of focus in the post-COVID era. How do we ensure that, this economy is brought to the mainstream and not just marginalized and considered as something other? The whole concept of health and health systems as a public good, rather than as something that you put some resources in when you have something left from the financial and productive sectors. How do we ensure that health infrastructure becomes a priority? So the whole human capital development is to be science, technology, and research. Africa needs to now understand the importance of industrializing, because most of what Africa needs to tackle this disease have to be imported from elsewhere. And with the supply chains growing, with the borders closing, with the ban on importations of critical, essential medical materials, it compromises Africa's ability to deal with this impact. So it's causing a self-reflection of not only African states, but also the private sector to really think about how you activate local production. And we're seeing massive innovation in this area and incredible ingenuity. You see young people getting together and innovating through small makeshift labs, ideas on how to test your condition and determine whether you go to the hospital or not, based on an app that tells you, several symptoms that you're having. We're having innovations of, basically tailors coming up and saying they're now going to invest in sewing masks so that there are enough out there. We have in Ethiopia young people who are using 3D printing to create this shields for supermarkets and other places so that business can continue. Most African countries have gone the way of the lockdown and social distances, as I said earlier, cannot be sustained without having a severe impact on livelihoods. And so the race to come up with these materials that are needed to provide more protection for people, particularly the health workers, those on the front lines supporting the health system, becomes critical. So Africa is starting to repurpose. Hand sanitizers are now being produced by companies, industries like the beer industry, for instance, and so on and so forth. So we're seeing a lot of creativity, a lot of innovation, a lot of reflection and rethinking. It's like you need a new development software for the continent. And from a UNDP perspective, this is really where our interest is. How do we not waste this crisis? How do we utilize this opportunity that's being created to see exactly where the fault lines are? Opportunities created for everyone to feel concerned. This is one issue that concerns everyone. No one is left out. I mean, literally, no one is left out. So it's not about the elite or the poor. It's about all of us. So how do we utilize this flattening, a leveling of the field to create a new momentum for the real kind of development that puts people at the center, that does not ignore the human capital development, that does not ignore the rural economy, that makes sure no one is left behind. These kinds of questions are now being asked. And we are exploring this through looking at socioeconomic impact assessments and trying to analyze how countries can build back strong. And we see this in about 4 dimensions. One, as I said, is making health a central focus of investments of countries. Health infrastructure, health systems, the software as well as the hardware. It cannot be ignored anymore. Second is ensuring that we are investing in the people. The African people are the best weapon to fight any disease, including this one. We saw that in the era of HIV/AIDS, struggling with that. It was those caregivers, those women, who really turned the tide. We saw that in the use of the artists, the African artists, to get the messages out. So it's not a question of just for the state to handle. It's how you pull the people in to deal with this. So governance needs to change, and a governance that really has this inclusivity about it. And these are all the areas where we're working. And then building back greener. It's another opportunity that we see. One of the things that's been exposed in this crisis is that we can't fight it without access to energy. Energy on the continent of Africa is not just about the main grid. It's about renewable energy. This is actually where the opportunity is. And that's the green energy is going to bring a new economy that is good for people and planet. So how do we build back green? And how do we invest in local production and utilize Africa's money for African development? These are all the questions. And how do we govern better? We're seeing the good leaders come out of this crisis. You see the strength and resilience and accountability of a leader by the way they're leading their country in a crisis situation. And we're seeing some good messages arising with the way some of the leaders are navigating this. Take South Africa. The South African president has rallied everyone, recognizing that this is not something that he's going to be able to do alone. So he builds in communities, he builds in people in the slums, he builds in the private sector, he brings everybody and creates a coalition and creates a solidarity fund. We're seeing the African Union at the continental level say the only way we can tackle this is through solidarity between African countries. So while at the beginning, everybody was like every country for themselves, now there is a rally together as a continent to say we need a solidarity flight. And we saw this from the Ethiopian Prime Minister, again showing incredible leadership to say we need to create partnerships that will allow us to procure bulk materials that can come to Ethiopia, and the Ethiopian airlines can then distribute this to other countries. And practically, this is how countries are getting testing materials, masks, and the things that they need. So this idea of a new software, a new political idea is the opportunity that COVID-19 brings. And that's what UNDP is investing in, where in all of the countries, practically all the countries in Africa, we have an offer on COVID response that includes helping countries to prepare for the surge, helping them to respond to the disease, and helping them to recover, to start charting the path for recovery. And using the entire UNDP international network for that, including sourcing best practices that then can inform the decisions that African countries make on which way they go, what options they follow, which is a pretty difficult decision to make right now without any blueprints. So this is, generally what we're invested in. It is unprecedented times. It is clear that the rest of the world cannot succeed in fighting this battle if Africa does not succeed. So there is a global sort of enlightened self-interest, is what the Secretary General called it. That as we, try to address this, that we understand that there is a continent called Africa where there's a lot to lose in terms of the last decades of investment in development gains that could be lost overnight if this is not stemmed, and also in terms of the human toll that it could take. But if it's not sorted in Africa, it's not going to be sorted anywhere else. And that's the narrative that we're advancing from the UN side. And I think I want to end with this thought, which is, this continent is quite resilient. It has a lot of resilient people. The answers can come from the African people themselves. And everything that we do